different locations here if you got a second.
Pop it to as many locations as you need.
All right. We're going to get her going here. Welcome to those of you who are just joining. Thanks for the invite here. It's always a little bit awkward to set these things up the way that TikTok does it. But
how you join a live? Yeah, it's so awkward.
So you'll have to excuse me. I'm feeling a little bit funky, like a little bit under the weather tonight. So I'm hanging in there. But if I don't bring the energy like I normally do, that's what's going on.
Right. We can always hit it up with the community, the people that are here. We can have them drive the conversation, whatever we need to do. But I appreciate you coming on. I know it's almost Thanksgiving, so this is fun.
Yeah, Dr. Albert, how many kids do you have?
I have 2 children.
Okay. So we've got 4, and it is the season to be passing everything around. So I think we're just all kind of fighting something off right now, but it's all good. I'm excited to do this. I'm excited to chat. There's a ton to talk about. You and I participated in kind of not a random, but a kind of a Twitter Spaces last night that I found to be a very interesting and constructive conversation. I don't know if you have an agenda of things that you're wanting to talk about tonight, but certainly we talked about a lot of interesting stuff last night.
Yeah, I mean, shout out to everyone who's joining tonight. First off, it might be worth doing a little bit of an intro just for you and me, for those who are new to either one of our platforms. And then maybe we can jump into it. So, thank you guys for coming to this Thanksgiving special that Dave and I are co-hosting, wherever you're tuning in from. I'm Dr. Mike Albert. I run a telehealth weight management clinic called Accomplished Health. I'm also a content creator primarily on TikTok, but also other social media platforms. You can find me at Michael Albert MD on all social media. Dave and I have crossed paths through our work on social media, and I would say have a budding and growing friendship through the work that we do. And, I think both are obviously deeply interested in all things obesity and weight related, whether it's industry, research and development, therapeutics, policy, the conversation at large. And so I'm really excited to have Dave on here to talk about a lot of those things that interest many of you, get his perspective, which is unique, and see where the night goes. And I'll try not to keep you too long, Dave, because I know that duty calls. It's Thanksgiving, and you're also on the mend. So I'll try to be sensitive to that as well. So whenever you need to bow out, just let me know. But that's my intro, Dave. I'm going to throw it over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invite to do this tonight. I'm Dave Knapp. For those of you who don't know me, I have a website called OnThePen.com. OnThePen.com is a patient resource, right? So it seems like all the news that's out there for type 2 diabetes medicine, obesity medicine, it's intended for one of 2 communities. It's intended either for the medical community, people like Dr. Albert, who does a fantastic job of breaking that stuff down for us all, or it's intended for the investor community. And most of the information that we get as patients flows from those 2 sources. And so what I really have efforted to do with On the Pen is to take that information that comes from those 2 sources, sort of digest it, and then package it in a way that's patient-centric, all to empower you all to have more competent, intelligent conversations with your medical providing team. So that's what we try to do at On the Pen. And so if you haven't checked it out, it's a great website, a great resource to get all the news. Of course, you're going to get my 10 cents on a lot of things, but much of it is just breaking news. It's what's going on in the world of current anti-obesity medications. It's what's going on in the world of future anti-obesity medications. And in doing this On the Pen, we started it about 2 years ago. And in doing so, I've got the chance to meet a lot of very, very smart people like Dr. Albert, whose opinions and thoughts I've really come to value, because he's just got a very, passionate drive to help people who are struggling with chronic disease of obesity. So it's a pleasure to be here, and we'll go for as long as I've got the energy here. I got the electrolytes going, so we'll hang in there. So let's do it.
Well, thanks everybody for coming once again. Make sure to tap the screen so the algorithm knows we're here and promotes it. But yeah, maybe we start out in just kind of a state of the industry update for people, because I know that everyone's always interested. There's a lot of cautious optimism on some level. Other people are concerned about what's happening. If you look at some of the things that Biden administration have said more recently, or if you look at the growing sort of Trump administration and figureheads that are being looked at to lead different departments or agencies, I think there's a lot of speculation as to how that might affect the obesity space. And maybe we can sort of talk a little bit about what we think might happen. Mind you, it's going to be a lot of speculation. So where I would just jump off, and then Dave, maybe you can pick up from there, is I think obviously it's hard to not interpret the Biden administration's announcement of a new proposal to cover anti-obesity medications for Medicare and Medicaid without thinking that that's some form of progress, and whether that gets enacted or not, I think what you're seeing is the temperature turn up. I think people are acknowledging that very clearly there needs to be some equitable access improvements. People are acknowledging that obviously obesity is a real problem and need help and need access to care. And so I find that development, whether or not it comes to fruition, I find that as a real positive, because it's the first time we've really heard someone of prominence and authority come out and say, you know what, these people do need access to treatment. And so to me, it seems like things continue to progress, albeit sometimes not as linearly as we would like. And so maybe that's where I'll leave it to you and love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, so there's a ton going on, a ton to unpack. So obviously the change of the administration is, I think, sort of a time to sort of step back and just kind of observe and listen to what everybody has to say on either side. I think, again, like you said, there's so much speculation right now. I find some of the nominees to some of these different positions very interesting from a patient perspective. I think, yeah. Sorry, I had a kid trying to enter, a little 4-year-old trying to interrupt me while you were asking the question. I'm not sure what the actual question was, but you kind of laid the groundwork for the change in the administration and what the Biden administration announced with the coverage of Medicare and Medicaid. I feel like everything that's happening right now is so difficult to parse through because it's all politically motivated. I think, the timing of what's going on with the Biden administration announcing this, I believe there's a 60-day window before something like that can even take effect, which puts it into the court of the new administration. So I think it was definitely a political move. I still see it from the patient perspective as a great move. I mean, it is progress. Like you said, it's hard to see it as anything other than that, but it's also like the thing that concerns me is the timing of it. Like, they've had 4 years to do this and they wait until the new administration's knocking on the door. And we know what some of the people that have been appointed to or could potentially be appointed to some of these positions, what their stances are. I just feel like, I hope that it's not a giant political football, like we see with so many other issues politically, that just gets bounced back and forth, and people, it seems like there's a lot of problems in Washington, D.C. that exist, that both parties like to exist because they're fundraising. It's easy to fundraise off of a problem that never goes away, because like, hey, we'll get in and we'll fix this, or hey, we'll get in and we'll fix this. And so it's like nothing ever really gets fixed, and I hope that it's not that. I think it is. If everything continues on, and Medicare does ultimately look at obesity as a disease and requires the coverage both for Medicare and Medicaid, I think that that's a huge win. I hear a lot of people talk about how GLP-1 medications are going to bankrupt the system, and as both a patient and a taxpayer, I have to step back from that and just go, okay, you have a medication that has contributed for the first time in my lifetime to a reduction in obesity. We know the sort of fingers that go out from obesity, whether it's heart failure or whether it's sleep things like sleep apnea or cancer, all these things that are treated when preemptively treated when you treat this disease of obesity. I think that GLP-1 medications have the GLP-1 medications and the horizon of other anti-obesity medications and treatments have the power to really save the healthcare system in the United States. So I think a lot of the political banter that goes back and forth is very short-sighted, because I really do think that they have the power to, based upon what we've seen in clinical trials, if the clinical trial data bears out in the real world, and we have a 99% reduction in people developing type 2 diabetes when they're treated with tirzepatide, that's pretty hard to ignore, the financial implications of people not becoming diabetic over the long term. Same with the reduction in cardiovascular events and things like that. So, I find what's going on in the current landscape interesting, whether we're talking about the appointment of certain people to cabinet positions, or we're talking about the Biden administration sort of, throwing this thing out there about this policy change for Medicare.
It's just interesting. It's definitely interesting to follow, but I think at the end of the day, it's all hopeful. It seems like progress in the right direction, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, I hate if obesity were to be used as a political tool. Especially knowing the history around obesity, it's been plagued by deception, false promises, all of this stuff for ages, for decades, for many people's lifetime. So I certainly hope they don't make a pronouncement like that and are only doing so very without real intent, right? Yeah, I think that would be a real shame to get people's hopes up and to not be very serious or intentional in wanting to follow that through. Well, I mean, we'll only know in time, right? And so we'll have to see how that plays out. When you look at the next administration, I think that at face value, there seem to be some positive signals around the health focus, make America healthy again. It's hard to disagree with that conceptually. I think what will be interesting to see if there's any real substance behind that. I think it's a nice political slogan. What does that actually mean for the population? Are they going to go after some of these companies that undoubtedly have contributed to the poor health of the American population? Are they going to overemphasize certain interventions to the point where others get de-emphasized that potentially people rely on? I think if history is any indication, people like their healthcare. They don't love it being taken away, whether it's because they have access to a treatment, whether they finally were granted access. That is not a good way to develop political goodwill. And so I really doubt that if this gets enacted in the next 60 days or so, that the Trump administration would roll it back in any meaningful way. I think it's just that would create a lot of pushback. And if you're someone who is encouraged by that development and the announcement by the Biden administration, definitely reach out to your congressperson, show your support. The Obesity Action Coalition, the OAC, has a website where you can, you can reach out to individuals involved in this decision-making process and let your voice be heard. So go to their website, let your voice be heard, and that's the way that change happens. It happens because we organize and we demand it. And so, I think the biggest mistake that could be made is that they announce this and then they don't hear any follow-up to it from the broader American public. And so hopefully everyone contributes their voice of support for this new policy and it goes into effect, and there's a hopefully, a downstream effect, a ripple effect from increased access to obesity care. And we'll just have to see once again.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if I had to pick one thing that I'm excited about that some of the like RFK Jr., like if I had to pick one thing that he's talked about that I think really is important that I would like to see personally, is I would like to see pharmaceutical advertising stopped in the United States. I see a real problem from a patient perspective when you turn on the news and where everybody's getting the news is largely funded by big pharma. It's like, how do I ever know that I'm getting the straight rub on certain medication when you've got, you're watching, for example, this past week, we saw Dr. Sanjay Gupta did a special on CNN for GLP-1s, right? But how do you know that you're getting something objective when you go to commercial break and it's, two people riding on Vespas through the Italian countryside and then talking about the side effects, like, like you're gonna have a whole long list of, I find that problematic. So I'd like to see that addressed. I do like the idea of getting some of the harmful things out of our food supply, but it seems like what my problem with all that then is that it seems to be like, we're gonna do this and that's gonna make everybody healthy again. It's like, wait a minute, there's a lot of people who are sick and relying on treatment to stay well. And what are we going to do about them, right? And I think that's where people's anxiety kind of gets ramped up when it comes to this. I think that a lot of this time will tell, but there have been some interesting appointments. If you want to get in the weeds a little bit, it's not just, I think people have, at least on TikTok, tended to be hyper focused on RFK Jr., right? But I think that the appointment to the head of the FDA is a really interesting appointment when you think about this guy is Makary, I think is his name, Dr. Makary, who is the chief medical officer for Sesame Health, which is a massive telehealth organization that prescribes GLP-1s, including compounded GLP-1s. I think that plays an interesting role in this whole compound debate and what's going on with the Outsourcing Facilities Association and the FDA. There's just so much that's just kind of up in the air right now that we just don't know how this is all going to shake out. And I think that's why it's so important for us at OnThePen, and certainly for you in the manner that you deliver information, to be getting good information out to people in a timely manner so that we can advocate. And that's something that we do on OnThePen.com quite a bit, is we'll not only throw an article up about X, Y, or Z that is happening, but we'll also say, here's a form that you can fill out, a pre-filled form, sign your name to it, send it to your senator. Here's the resource to find your senator, their contact information. So we've done a lot of that advocating at OnThePen.com. And I think that getting timely information out, but then also, like you said earlier, getting activated, like this community, I think it's unique. The obesity community, one of the things that I've said a lot lately, because it's just been on my heart, because I've gotten to know this community so well over the last 2 years, is when you live with the chronic disease of obesity, more than likely you've spent a good majority of your life efforting, white knuckling, working extremely hard to not be obese, to not be overweight. And oftentimes we white knuckle it, we work extremely hard and we don't see a lot of benefit from it. It's not, we don't, most of us conquer obesity with eat less and move more. It's this roller coaster. And so I think what it's done is it's conditioned us to work extremely hard. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest misconceptions about people living with obesity, is that we're lazy. And I would say that I would flip that on its head and say, you know what, the obesity community is uniquely equipped, uniquely hardwired to work extremely hard, and to work extremely hard, even if it might not pay off in the way that we want it to. And so I think this community is so unique. And I think that you're spot on when you say we've got to let people know, we've got to let our congressmen, our senators know that we're in support of Medicare and Medicaid covering covering the disease of obesity. And one of the things that I was looking at, Dr. Albert, this week is the response to COVID. Our government spent $4.5 trillion on the COVID response. $4.5 trillion. The amount of money, and the I'd like to maybe get into this a little bit if you're interested, or if you've gone down this rabbit hole. The numbers that they presented along with this policy change for covering obesity medications for Medicare and Medicaid was something to the tune of like $28 billion or $28 billion. You know, what's $4 billion? But honestly, what is $4 billion? What's $28 billion when you're talking about trillions? And so if we covered these medications and based upon the numbers that they came up with, that's less than 1% of what we spent on the COVID response. And when you think about the impacts of obesity on our society, both from a productivity standpoint, from a burden standpoint on the medical system, like it's a drop in the bucket. And so how do we get our legislators to see and understand that the same way they understood the urgency of moving on COVID? I just find it, I remember watching those bills get passed during COVID and going, they better not ever come at us with, we don't have enough money for this or that again. If you could come up with that staggering amount of money for the COVID response, then certainly we can come up with the money that we need to treat obesity, especially for the most vulnerable people in our population. My opinion.
It's interesting on the cost point. So we talked a little bit about this last night in the group that you and I were in, and I think there's a ton of focus on cost of care, whether it's cost of therapeutics, what would that mean to introduce access to all these individuals, and it's really easy to quantify cost, right? Because those numbers are far more widely available. They're less abstract. If Novo charges X amount of dollars per month, you can do the math on that. Multiply by however many people times 12, right? And that's going to be your annual cost. Far easier to come up with that number than it is the savings or the value of a particular therapeutic to society. Why is that the case? Well, the return on that investment may be in the form of a more productive member of society. A return on that investment may be in the form of a diagnosis avoided and the downstream cost associated with the diagnosis avoided. That's far more abstract. Mm-hmm. What is the value of presenteeism? What is the value of avoiding diabetes? Well, it depends, and at what scale. And the problem is we don't have great data on this sort of downstream savings related to these drugs yet. And because of it, a lot of these economic impact studies that have been done are far more heavily weighted towards the cost because it's, once again, metrics that we understand and we get, and they're fairly, discrete. And so even in the CBO report, if you read the fine details, they talk very specifically about how they struggle to quantify the savings for things like heart attack avoidance, mortality avoidance, all of those things. And there's virtually no consideration for the indirect savings being presenteeism, decreased absenteeism, right? All those other things, those work productivity considerations, all of that. And we know from prior work that's a significant portion of the benefit of these therapeutics. People are able to do more, be involved in more, be present more, which is a really worthy consideration. That means people are able to really seize life in a different way than they could previously. And so you have to take any of these sort of economic reports with a grain of salt, because they're not really quantifying the cost and savings in a way that takes into account all of the variables. And then the other portion of it is there's always you got to be careful who is promoting these, because they almost always have an agenda in the case of PBMs and whoever, the CBO is pretty unbiased. They try to be, at least, but I think they're very imperfect. So that's just when you talk about the numbers, let alone the value of investing as a society in that, which I totally agree. We make so many investments as a society in things that are, many could argue, relatively trivial or a waste of investment, that because they yield such poor return. It's a pretty easy argument to make that investing in obesity, chronic disease care, improving the lives of individuals, that's a meaningful investment. It's hard not to appreciate that. And so I think that a lot of this conversation is still relatively young, sort of in the life cycle. And I think as we go further and further, down this sort of road, we're going to have a much better understanding and appreciation of the value of really providing adequate obesity treatment and obesity care. And so I think we do a little bit of a disservice when we try to come up with these estimates now that I think really miss the mark and are not very descriptive of reality.
Yeah, and I think it's an excellent point to make. You can't qualify or quantify on paper, not somebody who doesn't get diagnosed with diabetes. But I think there's so much good data right now, both coming out of the clinical trials for these medications that are just really hard to dispute. Now, I think a lot of that, like I said earlier, will come down to how much that data bears out in the real world versus a really controlled clinical trial that's trying to get the results that they're after. One thing that I found interesting about the Medicare numbers that they threw out was, I think it was only like 3 or 4 million people that it was estimating to gain coverage based upon the change. And that was the number that really stuck out to me more than anything, because I looked at that and I go, the numbers that they come up with is how much this is going to save. I think you can, you and I both look at that and you go, well, they're not, this is a very short-term look at how much it's going to cost to cover these medications, but it's not a long-term, look into how much it could save in the future. But I found that number to be very interesting. What did you make of that number? Because, I think 50% of people on Medicare probably would qualify for GLP-1 medications for anti-obesity therapy. Certainly a good number of them are already diabetic, just at the age, if they've lived, a good chunk of their life with obesity. A lot of them are probably diabetic and get access to GLP-1s that way. But I found that number to be very curious. And that's where I kind of looked at the numbers and I go, I hope this is a serious thing. And that the next administration doesn't come in and just go, these numbers are garbage. This is how many people would actually, be qualifying for that, which has got to be way more than 3 or 4 million. I believe it's like 50 million people, 100 million people on Medicare. I can't remember. I remember thinking, like, kind of doing the math in my head. I don't know if it was 100 million people. So I was thinking there was probably around 50 that would qualify, or if it was 50 million, and I was thinking maybe it'd be more like 25, but whatever it is, it's way more than 4 million. Sure. What did you make of that?
Yeah. And I would briefly say we can quantify the savings in disease avoidance and costs associated with disease. It's just hard to do. It's far easier to quantify costs related to a drug that we know all the variables around today. And so I would just say that data is coming. I know people looking at it. It's going to take longer to get. And then once again, doing a few points of multiplication based on Novo Nordisk list price, right? To address your question specifically, though, around this idea that only 4 million seniors, Medicare beneficiaries would be eligible, I agree. That number doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I think where a lot of the estimate came from is the fact that they're looking at historical data around drug uptake among populations, similar populations. They're trying to balance that against the utilization of drug currently in the broader U.S. adult community. If you look at it, the data is a little bit sketchy. If you look at it, it's probably around 8 to 10 million people that are actively on GLP-1s, which U.S. adult population is far larger than that, in the hundreds of millions. So I think they're trying to look at all this data and model and estimate the best they can. I think it just, they're not taking into consideration, the growing number of indications for these drugs, the enthusiasm for these medications because of the efficacy of them. And so I think it's probably an underestimate of the number of people that would truly be eligible and then also want to take them if they were given the opportunity to. And I think that's a pretty unique thing to GLP-1s, I would say. A lot of people don't want to take drugs. So it's a pretty safe assumption to be like, yeah, 8% of the eligible population will take this drug. Okay, but with GLP-1s, the benefits are very tangible. They're very real. People can literally feel them. That is not always the case. Not necessarily the case when you're taking your diabetes med or your blood pressure med or whatever. And so it's easier to disassociate yourself from the medication because it's hard to appreciate it day in and day out. Whereas GLP-1s in highly effective obesity treatments, you live the benefit, right? Every day you live the benefit. And you talk to many patients. I've spoken to thousands over the years. I mean, just this, some of the subtle benefits of being like, I can go throughout the whole day without having to think about food. And what a relief that is. What a decrease in burden that is on me in my everyday. Like I can dedicate more cognitive, emotional energy to other things. And I'm not worried about when my next meal is going to come or what I'm going to eat. And it's such a relief. People live the benefits of these drugs. And so if anything, I would say it's a gross underestimate of the enthusiasm for it, for the Medicare population. I take care of a ton of Medicare patients in our population. We're one of the few telehealth companies that takes care of Medicaid and Medicare patients. And I can just tell you, they're as enthusiastic of a group as anyone else, whether it's the teenagers or the young adults or sort of the full adults. So yeah, I think those numbers are a little bit bogus, to be honest.
Yeah, and that's the part is I made a video today. You always, anytime you're talking about politics, you kind of like just you hit upload and then you're like, right. Like I don't intend to be political about this stuff. There are just political ramifications right now, so it's hard not to talk about this stuff. But those numbers particularly are the numbers that I was thinking like, I hope that this is serious given the timing and that it's not just a setup for the incoming administration to go like, look, it's not 4 million, it's 20 million.
Right.
And if it's 20 million, this is what happens. But even if they would, that's where I kind of go back to if we spent $4.5 trillion, and I think we start throwing out billions and trillions and people don't like make the connection in their head about how different a trillion is to a billion.
Right.
But you're talking about less than 1%, 0.5%, about 0.5% of the cost of what we spent on COVID is what they're estimating this to cost. Now, even if it's 10 times that, to get in, to kind of go back to what you're saying about the avoidance of disease, what's more expensive for Medicare, 10 years of GLP-1 or a week in a hospital because of a heart attack. It's like I hope that better numbers are coming, and I hope that the incoming administration takes that seriously. I think you touched on a point that I wanted to kind of pick your brain about too. So Dr. Albert and I were both at Obesity Week. We got a chance to chat a little bit while we were down there. But one of the things that I found to be really interesting was the disconnect within. So that for those who don't know, Obesity Week is put on by the Obesity Society, and a really great organization who has fought very hard to get obesity treated like a disease, not only in the medical community, but outside of the medical community. And it's a lot of presentations. I think you had one there. It's a lot of presentations by doctors and pharmaceutical companies on current therapies. The thing I heard over and over and over was about this big problem that we have about people who are not staying on GLP-1 therapy. And I just had to laugh every time I heard it, because it's like the disconnect in the medical community based upon the numbers that they're seeing and the actual reasons people are quitting GLP-1 therapy. It's just such a huge disconnect. They're like, 50% of people get off of them after a year or 2 years or whatever it was. And I'm like, they're getting off of it because they can't afford it. They're getting off of it because their insurance is changing. They're getting off it because they're sick of trying to find their medicine every month. There's 1,000 reasons why they're getting off. And one tiny reason is side effects. There are a certain number of people who do quit it because of side effects, but it's not 50%. It's a very small percentage, and the rest of the people are like, you're going to pry my GLP-1 medications away from me, from my cold, dead hands. And so I just found that interesting. So what are your thoughts kind of about how the medical community is viewing that? Because you see people very excited about MariTide, right? It's a once a month treatment. People will stay on the treatment for longer. And I'm just going, maybe, but I don't think that. I think it's more exciting because it's another option more than anything. Not that it addresses a problem that pharmacy. There just seems to be a big disconnect. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of dimensions to this. One, just speaking of industry and research. So full disclosure, I've done consulting for a number of pharmaceutical companies. The most recent I've done for Novo Nordisk. And I can tell you there's a lot of focus. I'm not speaking to Novo, but just the industry as a whole. There's a lot of focus on let's have these drugs be once a year. Let's have them be quarterly or once a month in the case of Amgen's MariTide. I think people overestimate the desire for that type of treatment. I think people like, to some degree, the flexibility of once weekly. Now, they don't love it when it's paired with supply shortages and other things that make it more difficult. So I can see why in the current market that might be more appealing. But it's the whole idea of people overestimating the concern about subcutaneous injections. I talk to all my patients, nobody cares. No one's really worried about a sub-Q injection. Everyone's like, oh, the oral therapies are going to revolutionize the industry. It's my patients don't care. They once a week is totally fine to them. They've never been bothered by it. And it's very clear, talking about the disconnect, it's very clear that there is a disconnect between people who are, proposing and forecasting what people want and what the market actually believes, what the market sentiment actually is. And then that certainly leads into, this technical term of drug persistence, which is just a term that researchers use to say how many people stay on a drug. And I think the challenge of a lot of the data that's been put out there is it's been led primarily by people with vested interests in describing GLP-1s in a negative light, and those are the pharmacy benefit managers, either because they don't want to have to pay for treatment, or as a plan administrator for a self-funded plan, they want to look good to the self-funded plan by keeping drug costs down. So it is to their benefit to suggest that people don't want to be on these drugs or have such a hard time staying on these drugs that they churn out. And so it's not a good investment. So we should remove the benefit. They are highly biased. Good science is not done in a highly biased way. And all of those studies to date are highly biased. And so I think we have to take a lot of that with a massive grain of salt. So I think you're right. There's a disconnect there. When you look at the actual data from the highest quality studies, with the latest drugs, so-called second generation obesity therapeutics, or GLP-1 therapeutics like semaglutide and tirzepatide, discontinuation rates are less than 5% in clinical trials. And you have to remember, clinical trials, they don't give people wiggle room in the protocols. So It's they're going to the next dose whether you like it or not, because they have to follow a scheme. They have to follow a protocol because they're wanting to assess it based on a particular understanding of how the drug is given. when you, and we don't have a lot of data on this yet, but I can just speak anecdotally to the many thousands of patients my clinic has served. When you are able to provide the dosing flexibility in the real world, when you are able to personalize how the drug is taken to the individual in front of you, the persistence is even better. The tolerance and adherence is even higher. And so, it is our experience that discontinuation, as long as the drug is in stock, they don't lose coverage of the medication, and you can personalize the way that the individual takes, is probably closer to less than 1%. So that is a far cry from the 30 and 60% persistence rates that PBMs put out there. And I think it's because that data is highly biased. It does not take into account shortages. It does not take into account the fact that people had their benefits changed in the middle of the year. It does not take into account that because someone's costs rose to the point where it wasn't sustainable, they transitioned to a compounding therapy. Like, it doesn't take any of this into account, right? So you're right. There is a disconnect. If people are propping up that data as the truth, I'm concerned about their ability to analyze and interpret data. And then two, I'm worried if they too have a vested interest in making sure GLP-1s fail. And to be honest, there are a lot of entities that don't want GLP-1s to do well because by some measure they have a competing product, whether it's, some type of procedure or surgical. I don't think these things are antagonistic, but you're going to hear heads of companies come out and say, oh, these drugs are so hard to take. And I'm like, dude, you have a product that competes with GLP-1. That's why you're saying that. So I like to give them a hard time. But those are my thoughts. I think you're right. There's a huge disconnect, and I think it doesn't reflect what we see in the real world at all, particularly if you account for all the variables.
Yeah. I kept hearing that over and over, and I was like, man, this is wild that they just think that this is gospel. I'm like, I just bring in just a random sample size of people who follow me on any social account, and they'll tell you otherwise. And I'm sure as somebody who prescribes an awful lot of these, you feel the same way. There's a question for you over on YouTube, if you don't mind taking a question.
Please.
So this is from Natalie, a member of the OTP community. She said, Dr. Albert, can you tell us about GLP-1s in people with heart disease and high blood pressure? How does it help this population and treat/prevent additional issues with heart issues? And then before you answer that, somebody asked if this will be on YouTube later. It's actually, I'm streaming this over to YouTube now. So if you want to go back and watch this.
We're live on YouTube.
Yeah, we're live everywhere. We're live on Twitter, YouTube, everywhere. So you will be able to go back and watch this sort of on demand over on YouTube. So just wanted to throw that out there as well. So
Celebrity, who is a moderator for me and a longtime follower in my community, she is off all her blood pressure meds. So, one of the outcomes of this is that if you do have cardiovascular diseases or risk factors that are in part due to the obesity, just adequate treatment of the obesity can decrease the burden of these other, what we would refer to as obesity-related complications, things like high blood pressure. Now, is all high blood pressure-related obesity? Absolutely not. But we know that some is. And so to the extent that you have an association between the two or a connection, you too can be like Celebrity and see a decrease in your medication for those indications because you're getting the root cause of your health problem treated adequately. But where do these cardiovascular benefits come from, right? Much as was made coming out of the SELECT trial. It's been this seminal study. It was one of the really first drugs that we have that have shown a benefit outside of the statin and cholesterol lowering therapies. And we think it's probably related to a few things. Unquestionably, we believe it's related to better disease treatment of obesity. What do I mean by that mechanistically? What I mean by that is a reduction in excess adipose tissue, which is what obesity is on some level, the accretion of excess adipose tissue. A reduction of excess adipose tissue in the subsequent changes in terms of the stresses on the body is a cardiovascular benefit, okay? And so purely stating weight loss provides cardiovascular benefits based on that mechanism. Now, based on rodent studies, based on mediation analyses, which is just a fancy technical analysis of the factors involved in the outcome, we also believe that there are other factors at play in terms of the cardiovascular benefit. So we think the GLP-1s likely have an anti-inflammatory benefit that is impacting the disease and the disease progression in people at risk of cardiovascular disease. And it's been very well established, causally established, meaning we've been able to prove cause and effect, that inflammation is involved in the development of, in particular, heart attacks. Okay, so we know that definitively, that inflammation. So if you can reduce systemic inflammation, then we know pretty confidently that you can lower one's cardiovascular risk. So it's likely also mediated by that. And I would posit there is a third factor that hasn't gotten as much attention, but it actually changes cardiovascular physiology. What do I mean by that? Well, we know in some elegant studies that it enhances tissue oxygenation, so it's improving blood flow throughout the body. Some of the best work has been done in peripheral arterial disease, that we've been able to quantify quite literally improve tissue oxygenation to the limbs of people with very diseased arteries, particularly in their legs. And so that improved oxygenation helps to reduce the burden of cardiovascular disease. Also related to that is it likely improves the function of the vessel itself. So the actual health of the vessel, and there are certain elements to that, but one that has been described as something called the endothelial function. And that's the way that the vessel, the internal components of the vessel move, react, and are involved in the flow of blood. And so if you can improve the way that the blood vessel is actually functioning on a cellular level, then it makes sense as an extension of that you can reduce the burden, the stress in the vessel that would potentially ultimately contribute to the development of heart disease or a major heart attack, right? A heart event. And so weight loss, which is really more fat reduction, the anti-inflammation effect, and the improvement in the cardiovascular, the blood vessel function, we all think likely contribute to the reduction in cardiovascular risk, the reduction in cardiovascular events that were described most famously now in that SELECT trial.
Very interesting. Incretin Science. I don't know if you can see the chat, but Incretin Science has a interesting response. I can't even read half of the words in that response, but I don't know if you have anything to add to that. And then we got another question on YouTube for you. If you
just keep them coming. We'll try to knock out as many of these as we can.
Yeah. So Sue the Dude wants to know, of all the medications that are like on the horizon right now, is there one in particular that gets you amped up?
For sure. We can talk about a few that I'm really excited about. I don't know that there's one, but I'll maybe give you a few. And would love to hear your thoughts too. Just as FYI, I don't see the incretin question. So if you're able to actually read it,
let's give it a stab. Incretins reduce the release of renin in the angiotensin renin aldosterone pathway.
Okay. Yeah. So there is a protein pathway that the kidneys help regulate called the RAS pathway, and renin's involved in that pathway. It helps to change the way that blood flows to the kidneys and around the body. And it's involved in regulating blood pressure as part of that, and resistance in the blood vessels. So getting back to the way that blood vessels function, that would be directly related to that. And yes, for sure, we actually know that it works directly on this system, and part of the way it's working on the system, which also gets into autonomic nervous function, plays a role in its kidney benefits. And it causes the kidneys to produce more water to secrete more water, and to also decrease reabsorption of salt. So one of the consequences of long-term use of these really high potency incretins, which is just another technical term for GLP-1, it's a categorical term technically, is that people get a little bit of a diuretic and natriuretic effect. So people can get dehydrated or it can have volume depletion, which is why they sometimes feel lightheaded, fatigued, have headaches, is because their kidneys are actually causing excess urination of water and salt. And so this is where the electrolytes and some things can play a role as part of GLP-1 maintenance and sort of everyday care. So that's a whole nother physiologic thing that we could go down if we really want to. Don't know how interesting that is to people, but it certainly impacts my clinical care of patients. I do want to bring it back to the original question, which was what medications am I most excited for? And then I'll give the reasoning. I'm going to say, and this may be, not as exciting. So really excited about retatrutide for a number of reasons. It's going to be the first drug that is a triple agonism. It means it activates 3 different and distinct pathways. It's the first one that I believe will have glucagon as part of the primary mechanism. We've long thought that glucagon was not a real target for metabolism and weight management because of other studies and other failed drugs that activated glucagon. And this is the first one that has shown that it actually is a highly effective target. So
have they looked at it for obesity prior to this? I mean, I know glucagon historically is just something that's existed pharmaceutically to get people's blood sugars up, right? Kind of like an emergency.
A number of uses, and it was never a very successful way to manipulate physiology positively. It's long been, to your point, associated as this counter-regulatory hormone for insulin. It does the opposite effect of insulin across many different organs and many different systems. And so we've often just put it in that box, and we've never considered it as a master regulator of weight-related metabolism, which it's now being increasingly looked at. So really excited for retatrutide. It obviously demonstrates, really highly efficacious, clinical outcomes, superior treatment across a range of different disease states, whether it's advanced metabolic associated liver disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes. And so I think it's going to be really exciting just in terms of really taking therapeutics to even another level, right? So like semaglutide raised the bar, then tirzepatide reset the bar, and retatrutide and even CagriSema, I think are going to raise the bar again. So although it looks like CagriSema is probably going to be closer to tirzepatide and retatrutide is probably going to be a little bit higher. We'll have to see what the phase 3 data shows. But
aren't we supposed to be getting some data like before the end of the year on CagriSema?
Yeah, they're supposed to report out some early data, some interim data from the phase 3. So we shouldn't be knowing soon. I know they were estimating 25 to 30% weight loss long term. I'm a little more bearish, probably closer to 25, but still, that would be another highly efficacious treatment, and it would work differently. So it also brings a unique mechanism. So retatrutide, or orforglipron, I'm going to sound like a Lilly fanboy, but I just think that they've been so smart with their pipeline development. Or orforglipron, which is an Eli Lilly product, it's the first small molecule GLP-1 agonist. So all the other GLP-1s to date are peptide-based. They're based on amino acid sequences. And because of that, they have some uniquely challenging manufacturing considerations, which is part of the reason manufacturing has not been able to scale as effectively. They also require cold storage and all of these different distribution challenges that make manufacturing, distributing it to hundreds of millions of people worldwide challenging. And orforglipron is going to be something, oh gosh, I'm getting verification requirements. Orforglipron is going to be something that they'll be able to mass produce like aspirin, right? Because it is just it's going to be an easy thing to synthesize and make it scale, like make it in huge sterile vats and stuff. So they'll be able to make hundreds of millions of units pretty easily. And so when you talk about the challenges of distribution, scaling manufacturing, they're just not going to be there with orforglipron like they are with the other peptide-based GLP-1s. And then the last one I'm super excited about I mean, there's so many, amycretin, Vikings drug, but I'm going to do ones that are sort of on the doorstep. Is MariTide going into phase 3, and that is because it is a unique mechanism in that it antagonizes GIP, which is totally novel, and it appears that that has a weight benefit as well as activating and inhibiting GIP signaling has a weight benefit. Now, how does that work? We don't entirely know. We think it sensitizes GLP-1's effects and it has some downstream potentiation. The point is, I know all the major researchers on this, none of them really know and are not very common. Why would you be able, it'd be like saying, we're going to block the effects of GLP-1, it's going to have the exact same effect as activating. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. Blocking insulin and activating insulin receptors have very wildly different effects, like opposing effects. So how does that work? I think it's fascinating. And the fact that they believe it could be a once monthly or even once quarterly treatment, I think is really novel. So I think it just for the novelty, I think the Amgen product's really interesting.
Yeah, I feel like I've been more bearish on MariTide. Of course, I'm excited about everything you mentioned too, for a lot of the same reasons. I would just add to with your Forglipron one. The interesting thing for me on that one is just the bioavailability, right? Because the reason that they haven't really been able to bring semaglutide to the market orally in a meaningful way for weight loss is because it takes way too much API to manufacture, because it requires a lot of peptide to get the same effect as the subcutaneous injection. With the small molecule, it lasts in your digestive system and is more effective. I do think that orforglipron seems to be okay, but it's interesting because there's another small molecule that Pfizer's been working on, which was a twice daily, and they had to scale that back because of liver enzyme issues. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But orforglipron's interesting. MariTide is interesting to me because I think what we've seen, I think they have a lot to prove, right? I don't think they've figured out their titration process, exactly. Because I think that like in phase 1s, you had a lot of dropout. I mean, I shouldn't say a lot of dropouts because there wasn't a lot of people in those studies, but the high dose people were dropping out because of really violent side effects. In the data that they released this week didn't include a lot more information around that. I think it makes sense, right? If you take a once monthly, and they said even they're looking at maybe even, spacing it out even farther in phase 3s, you're stuck with those side effects for a while. Like you take, if you dose up in tirzepatide or semaglutide, it's a couple days and that thing should start to mellow out for you. Yep. But something with a half-life of a month, or I can't even remember what the half-life of it is, but it's measured in weeks instead of days.
Right.
I think that's an interesting one. The GIP antagonism you talked about, I'm interested to see how the information bears out on bone density loss. There was some kind of like interesting information in a drop that Amgen had a couple weeks ago on MariTide that seemed to show that there was some pretty significant bone density issues, like much higher than with tirzepatide. But again, this is a very small patient size. This is I believe was phase 2 data. But anyways, MariTide's got a lot to prove for me, but it is interesting, and just kind of a different approach. I think it is wild that they can just basically mess with GIP one way or the other and get kind of similar results. One of the things that I'm excited about, like obviously all the things you mentioned, I'm most excited about CagriSema because it's the next one. But I think what I'm really excited about, and I'll be airing an interview tomorrow with the CEO of Fractal Health. Fractal Health is a really intriguing company. So their CEO, Harith Rajagopalan, came on and interviewed with me, and he talked about their Rejuva and their Revita program. And I don't know if you've looked at those at all, but the Rejuva program is basically a resurfacing of the mucosal lining of the duodenum, which is showing to basically have a helpful effect at for people who don't know all this is what I was educated on. The duodenum is basically the cells in the mucosal lining of your duodenum, which is, where the food enters after it's in your stomach. It senses the nutrients, right? And so then it starts to communicate with your brain as to what nutrients, what quantities of nutrients you're consuming. And then there's hormonal response and physiological responses that happen in light of what it senses. And in people who are metabolically ill, especially type 2 diabetics, those cells become, or the hypothesis is that those cells become sort of dysregulated. And so they go in and they do a resurfacing, like basically just kind of like with warm water, cause those cells to regenerate over a couple of days with an endoscopic procedure, and basically regrows the mucosal lining and really helps diabetics in terms of their insulin response, and even things like nutrient stimulated hormones like GLP-1. The other one, which is the Revita, is an interesting one because that's their gene therapy. And they're basically going into your DNA and programming it to respond with more GLP-1, so more endogenous GLP-1. And they did a head-to-head trial, I believe, in pigs. And so this trial is entering in human stages, but in pigs. And so they did a head-to-head trial with semaglutide with really good results for their gene therapy. And so that one's really interesting to me. It's cool to me to see it's kind of the best of what the bariatric world has learned and the best of maybe what the pharmaceutical world has learned, and sort of melding those into treatments that get more to kind of the root cause or root issues. And so those are really fascinating to me as somebody who lives with, just as from the perspective of somebody who lives with the disease. Both of those procedures to me I would be signing up in a heartbeat for those clinical trials. So that's and maybe it's just I'm excited about them now because I'm just learning about them. I mean, I covered the one and done GLP-1 about a year ago, but I didn't get much more information than that. So this was a really interesting interview, and I'll be airing that interview tomorrow on the Pen on YouTube.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think what they're doing is really innovative. I certainly know I've been to their lectures. I've read a lot of their data. I certainly know they're highly enthusiastic. I think it warrants a bit of skepticism just from other data, that would question the level of effect that would truly have, in humans. But I think the early signs are encouraging. So let's see what the data shows. They're starting to do human trials now, and at any type of real scale. And they've gotten a breakthrough designation from the FDA. So, let's see what the human trials show and see what the durability is for any of these procedures. It's interesting. A lot of people don't appreciate bariatric surgery doesn't actually work because of the restriction that it causes, the mechanical restriction. Most people aren't aware of that. It actually works because of the changes to the gut. So you talked about the duodenal resurfacing. Bariatric surgery causes similar changes to the small intestinal microbiome, cellular physiology that causes endogenous increases in GLP-1, and a whole range of downstream effects from effectively the replumbing of the GI system. It's the replumbing that causes these physiologic and hormonal changes that ultimately lead to the long-term weight reduction effects. Most people think it's because they shrink the stomach or something. We used to believe that. It's been disproven about 20 plus years ago, actually. So that's a lot of people. I still even have patients come today. It's like, I don't want to shrink my stomach. It's like, that's not how it works, actually. So it actually works by changing your gastrointestinal physiology. So I think that's really fascinating. It's like a different take on it. It's sort of trying to get at the same thing through a slightly different approach, and be interesting to see what does that lead to in terms of outcome. Can you get similar outcomes to bariatric surgery with a less invasive approach? We'll see. Time will tell. My skepticism around enhancing endogenous GLP-1 and what that would lead to is this. Peripheral GLP-1 activity, like what you get coming from the pancreas and the small intestine, has a lot of metabolic effects, which help to control blood sugar, help to control immune regulation, and so on. But GLP-1's weight loss effect is all centrally mediated. It's not. This is a misconception. I've been saying it for years, and I still hear people say it's because of what it does in slowing gastric. No, that has been disproven. It is how it works through what was called the afferent vagus nervous system. So the nerves that are coming back through the vagus, which is a central nerve, to the brain, are bringing all these different nerve tracts, and through one particular element of the vagus nerve tract called the nucleus tractus solitarius, GLP-1 receptors activate that circuit, which has downstream appetite. It modulates food reward, which gets into the food noise effects. And so can you stimulate those tracts by just increasing peripheral GLP-1? To date, no, not effectively, which is why often bariatric surgery doesn't lead to that food noise reduction, because just increasing peripheral GLP-1 doesn't have that same central effect. The reason synthetic GLP-1s do this is because they're manufactured to work a little bit differently than biologic endogenous GLP-1. So they exist longer. They are configured slightly differently to engage the receptor differently. So they're a little bit different than native GLP-1. And because of that, we believe they have deeper penetration in the central nervous system. And so I am skeptical about how good a peripheral acting GLP-1 treatment truly is on the weight loss outcome. Maybe metabolically it has good blood sugar control, good all these other things, maybe even, anti-inflammatory, so on. But I'm skeptical about the weight benefit because of some other data that would suggest it might not be as effective. So we'll have to see, but I think the fractal technology, incredibly innovative. I am familiar with and have had conversations with the CEO and their chief medical officer. So I think what they're doing is really exciting. And I always respect people that are bringing a completely novel approach to a longstanding problem. I think that's terrific to shake things up. And who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's going to be incredibly innovative and totally disrupt things. And if so, the patients will be the beneficiaries. So I think a lot of. This is, you and I talk about this all. It's just so much exciting stuff. It'll be interesting to see what actually lands once it hits the market. Which drugs really, are going to be highly effective and safe in their phase 3 data. That they can challenge the Wegovy's and the Zepbounds and Mounjaros of the world. I think regardless of how it shakes out, I think what's undeniable is we're going to have a whole armamentarium of highly effective treatments that are coming. And it may be that only half of them make it to market, but we're going to be sitting here 10, 15 years from now being like, we've got like 20 drugs that can treat obesity and maybe 5 different types of procedures and, even refined surgical techniques. And once again, people living with the disease today are going to be the beneficiaries of all that scientific innovation.
Absolutely. It's a really exciting time to be sort of just following all this, because there's always something new. It seems like that somebody's coming up with, and that's why I really am intrigued by Fractal, because their approach is novel and unique, and it's not just about making better medicine. It's about how can we maybe get to the root cause of some of this. And as you stated, the clinical trials will bear out how effective they are or not. But I hope that people will tune in, because I actually did bring up some of those very points that you brought up about endogenous GLP-1 and the fact that it's not, the pharmaceutical versions are different and last longer. And so, we did get into that. So I hope people will watch. There's a question over here on YouTube that somebody has. Is there any clinical trials underway for those under 18? Childhood obesity is still a huge problem. What are the barriers, risk for prescribing Zepbound to teens? I can feel that a little bit. There definitely are clinical trials, both liraglutide, semaglutide, tirzepatide. There are trials going on in children, I believe, much younger than 18, 6 years old. I think there was a liraglutide study. So I don't know if you're familiar with any of those, but I definitely know that they are going on.
Yeah, there's a number of them. Tirzepatide's being studied now. We've had studies for semaglutide, liraglutide, metformin, orlistat. Qsymia. We've got a number of FDA-approved treatments now for adolescent obesity, which include Qsymia, Saxenda, Wegovy. I don't even know I can't remember if metformin is actually FDA approved, but it's definitely used in orlistat. So I think we have a growing stable of treatments, and more studies are being done, which I think will once again provide even more options. So yeah, I mean, they're looking at all different age groups. I think the focus up to this point has been primarily adolescents. I think that's due to everyone's sensitivity of starting a long-term treatment in someone super, super young. Although we may come to find that that indeed is the right approach. I think it will be borne out in time with research and whether or not they can convince ethical review boards that that's the right thing to do to study it in that population. But I know people are going to be ultra sensitive with people that are pre-adolescent. So yeah. Just quickly to touch on a point in my comments, glucagon, the novelty of glucagon activity, you get an increase in energy expenditure, so actually an increase in metabolism that is a material increase, and you get an increase in hepatic, lipolysis. So it's breaking down hepatic fat, and so both of those are metabolically favorable changes for a lot of people with obesity that are going to have various degrees of metabolic dysfunction that impact their energy expenditure as well as their liver metabolism. And then the other comment, just briefly, people asking about what's the mechanism for appetite dysfunction. While we don't know definitively, and why do people with obesity develop this, we do know that probably chronic inflammation plays a role, that it alters the way that brain signals are transmitted. We do believe that peripheral hormone activity is involved, such that the brain is no longer sensitive to things like leptin, insulin, and the like. We do believe that there are cellular changes due to epigenetic effects. So epigenetic being the way in which genes are turned on and off over someone's life. There was a study that was just published that showed this particularly in mice with obesity, that in a diet-induced mice model, they were able to quantify epigenetic changes that caused almost a cellular memory of the obesity state. And so even though they made these mice diet down and lose weight, their cells quite literally remembered the obesity and was pulling them back up. And we do believe that is part of the mechanism in humans as well, that so-called sort of obesity memory epigenetic effect. So it's like with everything in biology, it's never quite as simple or black and white as it seems. It's generally fairly nuanced, but all of those things are likely involved to some level based on research that we've done. And so when people say, just lose weight, just try harder, blah, 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 fix your appetite, stop eating, put the fork down, Karen, all this really crude and insensitive stuff, it's far more complicated than just a choice. It's far more complicated, particularly at the appetite level, particularly in terms of the way that hormones are being signaled and the brain is functioning. And a lot of that is going on is happening at a subconscious level. You're not even able to go in and tinker with it. It's happening below your consciousness. And so it's just going on in your body on a particular level. And so that is why we've seen with many of these treatments that affect a lot of this subconscious physiology, the way the body functions, they can have a profound effect, because you can go work out at Orange Theory, you can go join any diet boot camp you want, but if there are things happening to you that you can't affect directly, it doesn't matter how much you care, it doesn't matter how much you try. And that's why these treatments hold a lot of promise for people that otherwise have not been able to realize that benefit, because they can finally get at those outstanding biological elements that have been out of reach of so many people up to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Comment over here on YouTube. Somebody wants to know if any of the pipeline drugs show improvement with muscle loss. And I would just say to that, that's a huge point of focus for anybody who's developing anti-obesity medications now. You've actually seen Eli Lilly actually bought an entire company, I believe, that had a asset called bimagrumab, and they're testing bimagrumab with both, I believe, tirzepatide and retatrutide. You could correct me if I'm out of bounds here, but I think that that drug was being developed for cancer patients to help them maintain their body composition initially, and then they started running trials with semaglutide, and then Eli Lilly bought him up. I know that Novo Nordisk is doing similar things with a company called Regeneron. So it's a huge point of focus. I think that the next generation of medications will focus more on the quality of weight loss, which is just a wonderful thing to think about. We're at a point where for a good percentage of the population, the therapies that are out there are very effective. But now it's like, oh, well, how do we dial this in and make it so when somebody gets down to their goal weight, they have a better, fat to lean tissue and muscle ratio. So it is happening.
Yeah. So there is a pathway in the body that's charged with breaking down protein or, lean tissues, right? And this pathway is the activin myostatin pathway. So activin, the small protein, can activate these activin type receptors. And so drugs have been developed historically for things like cancer cachexia, muscle wasting conditions, so like myopathies. There are some congenital conditions that way. Bimagrumab was one of those that was being looked at for a range of these sort of protein catabolism type disorders. And it does so by, in essence, blocking the activity of this pathway. And thus the body stops breaking down protein at the same level, right? At a cellular level. And so you can do that, and then you create a relative anabolic state for that individual. So even though they may be losing because they're in an energy deficit or losing mass, you can prevent the pathway that causes protein breakdown. Now, one thing I would add is we don't have long-term data on the safety of this. And so it's not like GLP-1s where we have 20 plus years of human trials and all this gajillion, over 1 million person years of exposure. We feel very confident that GLP-1s aren't this overly problematic drug class. We can't say the same with this activin myostatin pathway. We just haven't had the same level of exposure, the same number of trials. So anytime that's new, like there should be an appropriate level of skepticism involved. The early studies are suggestive that it could be very complementary with what we call typical anorexigenic agents. Anorexigenic means it's promoting sort of decreased appetite. So you could, in theory, cause someone to decrease the amount they're eating and thus promote an energy deficit while while inhibiting or blocking the protein catabolism, muscle catabolism pathway, which would cause them to differentially just lose from fat tissue and not from muscle. And so that would create an ideal ratio, to your point, of fat tissue to lean tissue. And when you think metabolically, we know from other studies, at least observational studies, that certain ratios are ideal for longevity, for lifespan, and health span in terms of fat tissue to lean tissue. So it'll be interesting to see. Bimagrumab's one, Taldefgrobep is one that Novo Nordisk is developing. They've demonstrated some clinical trial data on that looks favorable. I think it's a really new mechanism. So once again, I would just everyone say we gotta get more data, a lot more data points before we can feel super confident. Anytime you're like totally shutting off a pathway, I'm always skeptical because there's always unintended consequence, even with GLP-1, So I think we'll have to see, but you're right in that we're not going to just be attacking obesity from the standpoint of really modulating appetite and doing these things like that's been the historical approach. We're going to start looking at lean tissue, start looking at peripheral, destruction of adipose tissue. We're going to start looking at what are called metabolic agents and leptin sensitizers and mitochondrial encouplers. So there's all these different mechanisms that are now going to be introduced that will potentially be part of the overall armamentarium against obesity. So really fascinating stuff because there is a potential outcome where you have a drug that has this mechanism and you layer it with a drug that spares lean tissue and you layer it with a drug that I'm just sort of hypothetically speaking, that increases energy expenditure safely and do all this, and you're like creating the holy grail concoction for obesity, right? You basically wipe out obesity if you can do that. So, in our lifetime, Dave, if you and I live long enough, hopefully we do, God willing, I think we're going to be able to totally obliterate obesity in terms of the burden it causes on society.
It's an amazing thought. Amazing thought, and exciting to kind of be at the forefront of learning about this stuff and sharing about it. I know that I never tire of learning about this stuff and bringing the information. Anything else that you wanted to touch on tonight that we didn't get to?
No, I mean, I think, just some parting thoughts, parting words for everyone. It's hard not to get caught up in the day-to-day stuff and see this plan drop coverage of obesity, this health system funded plan no longer has coverage. My employer changed the benefits, some of the negative things that are said around, do people even deserve treatments like Ozempic, which seems to be the catch-all term for all obesity treatments these days. It's hard not to get caught up in that and feel very pessimistic on a day-to-day basis. But having been deeply engrossed in this space at multiple levels, public policy, industry, day-to-day clinical, it is unquestionable that we have seen progress in the time that I've been involved. If you take a step back at a 50,000-foot level, there is discussion happening at every level of society. It's being talked about by the president, by the incoming administration. Everyone is aware of the concept of obesity as a disease. Now, they may fall on different ends of that argument, but we're having the conversation. The narrative is shifting. People are more willing to talk to their doctors and healthcare providers about it. When I take a step back and I don't get caught up in the day-to-day pessimism, it is very encouraging when we look at the direction that this is headed in terms of society opening its arms and embracing obesity as a disease and those that live with it. Are we where we need to be? Absolutely not. But I think it's unquestionable that there have been positive developments, that the net change has been highly positive. And so that encourages me, that fills my cup to keep going and to keep pushing. And so I would just encourage people, if at any point you feel disgruntled or discouraged by what you're seeing or how it's impacting you, we're seeing positive change, and that net change, those tailwinds, they're there. And so, we need to keep doing our work. We need to advocate. You need to call your senator, go to OnThePen website, be involved in Obesity Action Coalition, all of these groups, be the change you want to see. But I'm really encouraged by the direction of all this.
Likewise, I don't think that I can add anything to that other than anybody who's watching tonight, make sure you follow Dr. Albert. If you're following Dr. Albert, not following OnThePen, vice versa. If you're watching on YouTube or Twitter, we're both on those platforms as well. So please make sure that you hit the thumbs up button over on YouTube, subscribe to Dr. Albert, subscribe to our channel here. We're getting close to 15,000 on YouTube. So thanks for those who have already done that. Dr. Albert, thanks for the invite tonight. And it's always a little clunky getting it going here on TikTok. I think I ended up hosting this, but I was watching you on my screen and he's like, hey, he's not on. And I'm like, invite. So, but thank you for the invite to do this. And it's always a great conversation and always just great to hear from other people that are as passionate about this as I am. And so I appreciate your time tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining me. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone, everybody's family. I hope everyone stays safe, enjoys the time with their loved ones. Make sure you follow, subscribe to Dave and Mai's channel. That helps, put the content out there. Anytime you comment on our post, helps with the algorithm. So appreciate any of the engagement you guys provide us in this highly algorithmic society we live in these days. And, as always, if you're looking for real weight management help, Accomplished Health is in 22, about to be 23 states. It's my telehealth obesity medicine practice. So go check us out and go check out OnThePen. And just appreciate everyone. Thanks for stopping by.